The autumn of 1982 smelled like rain and cheap hairspray. The Cure was on the record player, Robert Smith's mournful voice filling the small space of our dorm room, while my roommate Sarah tried to tease her blonde hair into a gravity-defying shape. Outside, a persistent northern England drizzle slicked the streets and blurred the ancient stones of the university buildings. It was our second year. The world felt full of possibilities, each one tasting like lukewarm tea and the promise of a future we hadn't figured out yet. "You're not even listening," Sarah said, catching my eyes in the mirror. I was staring out the window, tracing the path a single raindrop made down the pane. "I am," I lied. "You were talking about the guy from the pub." "No, I was talking about the guy who makes the guy from the pub look like a troll. The new chemistry lecturer, Professor Vale." I finally turned. "The one everyone's whispering about?" Whispering. "Emma, they're practically writing sonnets. He looks young, don't you think? Maybe late 20s? But for all we know, he's got a wife and kids tucked away in some manor house. No one knows a single thing about him, which is why everyone's obsessed. And he drove up in a black Jaguar that looks like it belongs to a film star." She finally gave up on her hair and flopped onto her bed. "He's beautiful. Like, tragically beautiful. The kind you read about in your weird old books." I threw a pillow at her. "They're not weird, they're classics." "Whatever. Wait a minute. Advanced organic chemistry. That's your class, isn't it? Is he your lecturer?" I just nodded, my stomach doing a little flip. Sarah's eyes went wide. "Oh, you are kidding me. You have to tell me everything, a full report." "He's just a man, Sarah," I said, trying to sound bored. But a little spark of curiosity had already been lit. The next day, I understood. The lecture hall was old, smelling of chalk dust and damp wool coats. The low murmur of students filled the air, a familiar, comforting hum. Then he walked in, and the hum just stopped. The air didn't just quiet, it stilled. Sarah was right. He was beautiful, but it wasn't the easy, smiling kind of handsome you saw on television. It was something sharper, more severe. He was tall and moved with an unnerving economy of motion, not a single gesture wasted as he placed his leather satchel on the desk. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his suit impeccably tailored. He looked completely out of place and yet, at the same time, like he owned the very stone the building was made of. He was a portrait from another century that had just decided to walk into ours. He didn't raise his voice, but when he spoke, the room became a vacuum, his words the only thing left. "Good morning. My name is Professor Vale." His voice was like his presence, calm, deep, and with an authority that didn't need to be earned. It simply was. I spent the first half of the lecture trying not to stare, focusing on the complex dance of molecules he was drawing on the board with a steady, precise hand. I told myself the breathless feeling in my chest was just intimidation. He was a genius, clearly, and I was just a student trying to keep up. And then he looked at me. It wasn't a glance. It wasn't a professor scanning the room. He was at his desk, and his eyes, a shade of blue-gray so pale they looked like a winter storm, lifted and found mine. The 100 other students between us disappeared. The world narrowed to the 10 yards of space that separated his desk from mine. It was a look of such focused intensity, it felt like a physical touch, a pressure building in my chest. I felt seen. Not just my face, but everything behind it. My hopes, my silly romantic notions, my conviction that love was something to be protected. It was all laid bare in a single, silent moment. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. I finally broke away, my cheeks burning, and stared down at my blank notebook, my pen clutched in my hand. I didn't look up again for the rest of the lecture. When the bell rang, the spell broke. I was shoving my books into my bag, desperate to escape, when my copy of Wuthering Heights slipped out and fell to the floor with a soft thud. I bent to get it, but his hand was there first. He picked it up, his long, pale fingers brushing the worn cover. He just looked at the title, then back at me. I was standing so close now I could see the impossibly dark ring around the stormy gray of his irises. A fascination with tragic love, he observed. It wasn't a question. His voice was even softer than it was in the lecture. A low murmur meant only for me. I think it's romantic, I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. Sadness, maybe, or something older. He held the book out to me. Be careful, he said, not to confuse tragedy with romance. His fingers brushed mine as I took it, and I swear I felt a jolt, like static on a dry day. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. Thank you, I managed, before turning and practically running from the room. That night, the sound of the cure felt different. The rain against the window sounded lonelier. I sat on my bed, the book still in my hands, and I couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze. He hadn't touched me, not really, but I felt marked, branded. Like a page in a book he had just decided to read, and I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that he wouldn't stop until he reached the end. For weeks, a silent, nerve-shredding rhythm defined my existence. I would arrive at the Dalton Lecture Theatre at St. Giles University and take my seat, 3 rows from the front, always on the left, and he would walk in. A ghost in a perfectly tailored suit, the scent of cold air and old paper clinging to him. The world would fall silent, and for an hour, I would live in the space between his calm, measured voice and the frantic beating of my own heart. He never singled me out. He never held my gaze again, not in the soul-stripping way he had that first day. But I felt his awareness of me. It was a low hum beneath the surface of his lectures, a current of energy that seemed to flow directly from him to me. I would feel the weight of his eyes on me when I was bent over my notes, and when I'd look up, he'd be focused on the board, his back to the class. It was a maddening, invisible dance, and it was starting to consume me. I threw myself into his class, my work becoming a strange kind of devotion. I wanted to prove I wasn't just another girl captivated by his looks. I wanted him to see my mind. I wanted to earn another moment of that intense, focused attention, but on my own terms. The topic of the lecture was entropy. Professor Vale spoke of it with a kind of grim intimacy, as if he were describing a personal enemy. He explained the second law of thermodynamics, how all ordered systems inevitably break down into chaos. It is the universe's only absolute truth, he said, his voice quiet but carrying a chilling finality. He scanned the room, his pale eyes seeming to absorb all the light. An inevitable march toward decay. All complexity, all structure, all of what we perceive as life, is merely a temporary, localized resistance against an unconquerable tide. His words settled over the room like a shroud. This wasn't just chemistry. It felt like a verdict on existence itself. He finished his point and then paused. A question, then, he said, his gaze sweeping over us. If the natural state of the universe is chaos, why is there order at all? Why is there life? He paused again, letting the question hang in the air, before his eyes found mine. Miss Hayes? My breath hitched. My name from his lips was a sound I hadn't realized I was starving for. I could feel every eye in the room turn to me. My mind raced, trying to formulate a textbook answer. But that wasn't what he was asking. A strange courage, one I didn't know I possessed, rose in me. I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady. Because it chooses to be, I said, my voice clearer than I expected. A single, perfectly sculpted eyebrow rose on his forehead. A molecule chooses? Miss Hayes? No, I said, my confidence growing. But life does. Life is the force that fights back. It takes the chaos of random atoms and it builds something. It creates order. It requires a constant input of energy. Of faith, I suppose. Believing that building something is better than letting it fall apart. I was rambling, my worlds of science and the romantic ideals from my books colliding. So you are positing, he said slowly, his eyes locked on mine, that love, for instance, is a form of chemical defiance against the second law of thermodynamics? A few students snickered. My face flushed with heat. I'm saying that anything that creates order where there was none is a kind of miracle, I finished quietly, even if it's only temporary. The air in the room was thick with a silence so profound, I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Professor Vale just stared at me. He wasn't looking at me like a student anymore. He was looking at me like he was seeing a ghost from a world he had long since forgotten. The mask of the detached academic had cracked, and for a split second I saw something ancient and raw in his eyes. A deep, bottomless well of sorrow. He cleared his throat, the mask slamming back into place. An interesting, if unscientific, perspective. Class dismissed. He turned away abruptly. I sank into my chair, my body trembling with a mixture of mortification and a strange, electric exhilaration. I waited until the room was nearly empty before I gathered my things. I had to pass his desk to get to the door. I kept my head down, willing myself to be invisible. Miss Hayes. His voice stopped me cold. I looked up. He was standing by his desk, his leather satchel in hand. Your final point, he said, his tone formal. That order is temporary. Do you believe, then, that the fight is ultimately futile? He was testing me. He was asking if my hope had a limit. No, I said, meeting his gaze. I don't think the value of something is measured by how long it lasts. The fight is the part that has meaning. He held my gaze for a long moment, his face a perfect, unreadable sculpture. Finally, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Yours is a very optimistic view of a chaotic universe, Miss Hayes. He walked past me and out of the lecture hall, leaving me alone in the vast, empty room. The scent of rain and cold stone he carried with him lingered in the air. I stood there, my heart aching with a feeling I couldn't name, and I knew with absolute certainty. He hadn't been talking about science anymore. He had been talking about himself. The aftermath of my thermodynamics of love speech was a subtle but profound shift in the ecosystem of St. Giles University. Before, I was just Emma Hayes, a quiet, studious girl who wore brightly colored jumpers. Now I was the girl Professor Vale actually spoke to. The whispers started as a trickle and became a current, following me through the dining hall and into the library. They weren't cruel, not yet, just curious. But they were enough to make me feel like I was living under glass. His attention felt constant, a physical weight on my skin. I would be walking across the main quad, the autumn leaves crunching under my boots, and I would feel it, a prickling on the back of my neck. I'd scan the courtyard, and just for a second I'd catch him. He wouldn't be standing still, waiting. He'd be in the middle of walking toward the faculty building, or pausing by the entrance as if to read a notice, but his head would be turned, his gaze fixed on me. The instant our eyes met, his focus would snap forward. He would continue on his path, disappearing into a stone archway without a backward glance, leaving me with nothing but the ghost of his attention and the frantic, unanswered question in my heart. He was a ghost at the edge of my life. a silent observer whose presence was a constant, low-grade hum of terror and longing. I ached for his attention and dreaded it in equal measure. My grades in his class were perfect, but my nights were a wreck. I would lie awake, replaying every fleeting glance, every formal, polite word, dissecting them for a meaning that wasn't there. I was coming apart at the seams, and no one could see it. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I sought refuge in the university's oldest library, a cavernous, hushed place that smelled of decaying paper and beeswax. I was meant to be researching for an essay, but I couldn't focus. Instead, I found myself in the fiction stacks, my fingers tracing the worn spines of the Gothic novels I loved. I pulled out a copy of Bram Stoker's Dracula and settled into a secluded alcove, hoping to lose myself in a world whose darkness felt safer than my own. An expert in the field, I see. The voice was a soft velvet whisper right behind me. I gasped, dropping the book. It hit the floor with a muffled thud. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Professor Vale stood there, hands tucked into the pockets of his tweed jacket. The shadows of the towering bookshelves clung to him, making his pale skin seem almost luminous. He hadn't made a sound. I'm sorry, I stammered, bending to retrieve the book. Don't be, he said, his eyes on the cover in my hands. I was merely curious. After our last conversation, I find myself wondering, what is the enduring appeal? Why are we as a species so drawn to the story of the monster who loves? He was closer than he had ever been. The air grew thick, heavy. This wasn't a professor asking a question. This was something else entirely. This was personal. I don't think we're drawn to the monster, I said, my voice barely audible. I think we're drawn to the man inside it. The idea that there's a part of him that remembers what it was like to be human. To feel my own words felt hollow, foolish. I was talking about a book, but I was thinking about him. He took a step closer and my breath caught. His gaze was intense, hypnotic. And what of his love? It is possessive. It is isolating. It consumes the object of its affection, a moth to a flame. Do you find that romantic? I find the devotion romantic, I whispered, my eyes welling with a sudden sharp ache. Why was he pushing me like this? The idea of a love that is stronger than time, stronger than death. To be loved so completely that it is the only thing keeping a soul from utter darkness. I trailed off, a single tear escaping and tracing a hot path down my cheek. His expression changed. The academic curiosity vanished, replaced by a flash of raw, violent anger. His jaw tightened, and his eyes, those pale winter storms, turned to ice. That is not love, he hissed, his voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural whisper. It is a cage. It is a curse. An eternity of watching everything you value wither and turn to dust while you remain. It is the loneliest damnation imaginable. To romanticize it is the peak of naivete. The cruelty in his voice was a physical blow. This wasn't an academic debate. This was a wound. He was speaking from a place of such profound, personal grief that the air crackled with it. I had no idea what kind of past would create that kind of pain in a man who looked my age, but its existence was undeniable. My quiet sob was the only sound in the suffocating silence. His face shattered. The anger dissolved in an instant, replaced by a look of sheer, horrified regret. He looked at me, at the tears now streaming down my face, as if he had just broken something priceless. Miss Hayes. Emma, he breathed, taking a half step toward me, his hand slightly raised as if to comfort me, before he snatched it back. The mask of the controlled, detached professor slammed back into place, but his eyes were wild with self-loathing. I apologize. That was unprofessional. Forgive me, and then he was gone. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor, leaving me alone in the aisle. I slid down the bookshelf until I was sitting on the floor, my arms wrapped around my knees, and I wept. I wasn't crying because he had been cruel. I was crying because I had seen a glimpse of the source of that cruelty, a wound so deep and so old it had poisoned him from the inside out. I had seen the man behind the perfect mask, and he was in more pain than I could possibly imagine. The library incident left a scar on the fragile silence between us. The anger in his voice, the raw pain that had bled through his perfect composure, had changed everything. Now, the tension wasn't just unspoken attraction. It was laced with something darker. Fear. A shared trauma. When he looked at me in the lecture hall, it was with a new, guarded intensity, as if I were a secret he regretted sharing. My heart ached for him, a constant, dull throb of empathy for a man whose wounds I couldn't possibly understand. Our fragile truce was rebuilt, ironically, on the neutral ground of science. I began staying after lectures, ostensibly to ask questions about stereoisomers and reaction mechanisms. They were legitimate questions, but we both knew they were an excuse. It was a way for us to be near each other in a space defined by rules and logic. A safe container for the volatile reaction happening between us. One evening, we were the last two people in the organic chemistry lab. Rain lashed against the tall, arched windows, the wind howling a lonely lament. Inside, the only sounds were the quiet hum of a ventilation hood and the gentle clinking of glassware. I was working on a tricky distillation, my hands unsteady as I tried to clamp a flask into place above a Bunsen burner. He was on the other side of the lab, marking papers under the focused glow of a desk lamp. "You're rushing it, Miss Hayes," he said, without looking up. His voice cut through the quiet, calm and sure. Patience is the most crucial element in chemistry, and in life. My cheeks flushed. Of course he had noticed. He noticed everything. "Sorry, Professor." I tried to adjust the clamp again, but my fingers were clumsy. The heavy glass flask slipped. Time seemed to stretch and warp. I saw the flask tilt, the clear, flammable liquid sloshing. I saw it begin its slow motion fall toward the blue flame. A gasp caught in my throat. My body was frozen, useless. What happened next broke the laws of physics. He had been 20 feet away, sitting at his desk. In the space between one frantic heartbeat and the next, he was in front of me. There was no sound of movement, no footfalls, no rush of air. It was a displacement. One moment he was there, the next he was here. A black blur. A tear in the fabric of the world. His hand shot out and caught the flask an inch before it would have shattered. His other arm wrapped around my waist, pulling me back against his body with a force that was both protective and absolute. I was pressed against him, my head tucked under his chin, the world muted by the solid wall of his chest. For a second, there was only the wild drumming of my own blood and the shocking, unnatural cold of his body. It was a deep, lifeless cold that seemed to leach the warmth from my very bones. But underneath the cold, there was something else. A faint, low-frequency hum vibrated through his body into mine. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling. A subtle, thrumming energy, like an overloaded electrical circuit. It didn't hurt, but it felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. The silence that followed was deafening. He hadn't moved. I hadn't moved. I was trapped in the impossible moment, my scientific mind screaming that what I had just witnessed, what I was feeling, could not be real. Slowly, as if waking from a trance, he released me. He took a deliberate step back, placing the flask safely on the bench. His movements were rigid, controlled, but I could see the panic warring in his pale eyes. He, the master of unshakable composure, had slipped. He had done something that could not be explained away. You need to be more careful," he said, his voice a low, strained rasp. He wouldn't look at me. I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, my mind reeling. But you were over there. The words came out as a choked whisper. He finally forced himself to look at me, and his expression was one of cold, hard dismissal. It was a mask, but it was a terrifying one. Adrenaline is a remarkable chemical, Miss Hayes. You must have been more startled than you realized. He was gaslighting me. He was telling me not to believe my own eyes, my own senses. Now, I suggest you pack up for the evening, he said, his tone clipped, formal. The lab is no place for a distracted mind. He turned his back on me and walked to the far side of the room, his shoulders ramrod straight. The conversation was over, but I just stood there, my hand pressed to my chest, where the memory of his unnatural cold and that deep vibrational hum still lingered. My rational mind was desperately trying to accept his explanation. Adrenaline, a trick of the light, shock. But the other part of me, the part that had felt him move like a shadow, the part that had felt the chilling absence of life in his touch, and the wrongness of that energy thrumming beneath it, knew the truth. It was a truth without a name, a terrifying, impossible secret. And it was standing right across the room, pretending to be human. December arrived, and St. Giles University emptied, the ancient stone courtyards falling silent under a blanket of frost. The obsession had become a fever in my blood, and I needed to escape. I fled to my aunt's small cottage in a village tucked deep within the Yorkshire Dales, hoping the silence of the moors could quiet the noise in my head. One afternoon, seeking a solitude that felt absolute, I walked to the lake. The world was rendered in shades of white and gray, the air so cold and still it felt like a held breath. The lake was a perfect, milky sheet of ice, the bare trees along its edge like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. For the first time in months, I felt completely, blessedly alone. I stood at the water's edge, watching my breath plume in the frozen air, my thoughts finally beginning to settle. And then I saw him. He was walking toward me along the shoreline, emerging from the winter mist that clung to the far side of the lake. A tall, dark shape against the stark white of the landscape. There was no car on the single-track road, no sound of footsteps on the frozen ground. He just appeared. My heart didn't just beat faster, it stopped. My blood turned to ice in my veins. This wasn't a coincidence, this was an impossibility. I was miles from Oakhaven, a ghost in a forgotten corner of the world. And he was here. He stopped a few feet from me, his hands in the pockets of his dark wool coat. His pale face was etched with a strange, weary relief, and his eyes held an aching intensity that stole the air from my lungs. "You are indeed here," he said. His voice was a low murmur, almost lost in the vast silence. It wasn't a greeting. It was a confirmation, a statement of fact that implied a search. Without saying a word, he had told me, "I was looking for you." "Professor," I breathed, the name feeling utterly inadequate. "What are you doing here?" "My family has a cabin, just beyond the fells," he said, his gaze sweeping over the frozen landscape. "We often come for the winter." The cold. It's quieting. It was a plausible explanation, and I clung to it. I had to. Because the alternative, that he had somehow sought me out, found me in this remote place by means I couldn't comprehend, was far too terrifying to face. We began to walk, our feet crunching softly on the frost-hardened earth. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was heavy with unspoken things. "It's strange," he said, his eyes on the horizon, "to see something so perfectly preserved, so still, knowing that underneath the water is still moving." He looked at me then. "It's a fragile kind of permanence." I knew he wasn't talking about the lake. He was talking about himself, about the restless, living thing trapped beneath his cold, still surface. "I don't think permanence is the point," I said quietly. I I think things are more beautiful because they can break." He was silent for a long time. "You have a remarkable capacity for hope, Emma." "And you don't?" I asked, my voice bolder than I intended. A look of profound ancient sadness passed over his face. "I believe in entropy," he said. "I have seen things fall apart. It is the one truth that never fails." He was speaking of his past, of the wound he carried. He was showing me the edges of his pain. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "Don't be." To fill the aching silence, I confessed my own truth. I told him I'd never been in love, not really. I told him about my books, about my foolish, childish hope that I was waiting for a love that was absolute, all-consuming. A love that would make the universe feel ordered, even for a moment. He listened without judgment, his expression unreadable. We had reached the path that led back to the village. The weak afternoon sun was already beginning to die, staining the clouds a pale, bruised purple. It was time for him to go. The impossibility of the moment came crashing back in. My scientific mind, the part of me that believed in rules and reason, screamed for an answer. "Professor," I said, stopping him as he turned to leave. "Alistair." He faced me, waiting. "How did you know I was here?" He looked at me, and the mask of the calm, controlled professor was completely gone. His face was a canvas of raw, heartbreaking conflict. I could see the truth fighting against the lie, the desire to confess at war with the need to protect. He took a half-step closer, the cold air around him seeming to drop another 10 degrees. "Don't ask me such difficult questions, Emma," he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. And then he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the mist as silently as he had arrived, leaving me alone by a frozen lake with a truth I couldn't prove and a feeling I could no longer deny. Returning to St. Giles after the winter break was like stepping into a dream. The world of lecture halls and textbooks felt flimsy and unreal, compared to the memory of that frozen lake, of the raw, aching honesty in his eyes. The silence between us was no longer just the space between a professor and his student. It was a shared secret, a question asked and a truth withheld. Every time our eyes met across the crowded room, the memory of that impossible meeting crackled in the air between us. The whispers from the other students had faded, replaced by a quiet, settled certainty. We were something. No one knew what, least of all me, but the connection was no longer a secret. It was a low, constant hum of awareness that followed me everywhere. He was losing his own battle. I could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the way his knuckles were white as he gripped the lectern. He was a man holding his breath, fighting a current that was dragging him inexorably toward me. The professional mask was still in place, but it was cracking at the edges. The inevitable break came during one of our tense post-lecture discussions. I was showing him my revised dissertation proposal. The words on the page, a flimsy excuse for the real conversation happening in the silent glances between us. He stared at the paper for a long time, his face a perfect, unreadable mask. "It's ambitious," he finally said, his voice impeccably formal. "The spectroscopic analysis you're proposing. The university's equipment is antiquated. You won't get the data you need." My heart sank. It felt like he was closing the one door still open between us. "So I should choose another topic?" He was silent. His pale eyes were fixed on my paper, but I knew he was seeing the frozen lake. When he looked up, the mask was gone. I saw only the tormented man, the prisoner debating whether to invite me into his cell. "Not necessarily," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur. "I have a private laboratory, at my home. The equipment is significantly more advanced. You could complete your preliminary research there, if you wish." The offer hung in the air. A professional solution. and the most dangerous invitation I had ever received. My mind screamed at me to say no, but my heart had already made its choice on that frozen shoreline. Yes, I heard myself say, the words soft but certain. Thank you, Professor. I'd be grateful. Saturday, then, he said, the mask of formality returning, a shield for us both. I'll pick you up at 10. Crowthergate Estate wasn't just a house. It was a monument to centuries of solitude. As his black Jaguar crunched up the long, unlit drive, I felt the weight of its history pressing in on me. He led me into a grand entrance hall. The air inside was cold and still, carrying the scent of beeswax, old stone, and dried roses. Dark, polished wood drank the light from the tall windows. And everywhere, there were portraits, generations of pale, stern-faced people, with Alistair's same unnerving stillness, their painted eyes seeming to follow my every move. I noticed it immediately. There were no mirrors. Alistair, darling, you've brought a guest. A woman emerged from an arched doorway. She was impossibly elegant, her silver hair coiled perfectly, her eyes the same stormy gray as his. But where his held a tempest, hers held a deep, settled sorrow. Grandmother, this is Miss Hayes, Alistair said, his voice tight. Emma! His grandmother smiled, a warm expression that didn't quite reach her sad eyes. It is a pleasure to meet you, Emma. Alistair so rarely brings his work home. She took my hand. Her skin was cool but not cold like his. It was a normal human touch. Please forgive the state of the house. It can be rather gloomy. It's beautiful, I managed. It is old, she corrected gently, her gaze flicking to her grandson with a look of profound, aching love, and full of memories. He led me down a long, echoing corridor to his lab. It was a sterile, brilliantly lit world of steel and glass, a sanctuary of logic in a house of ghosts. For hours we worked, and for a little while it almost felt normal. The light outside began to fade. We were standing side by side at a spectrometer, our arms brushing. The sterile space suddenly felt charged, intimate. I could feel the heat of my own body, the frantic pulse at my wrist, and was intensely aware of the cold, still space he occupied beside me. It's a perfect baseline, I whispered, my voice thick. Yes, he said, his voice a low murmur. He wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at me. His eyes were dark, the academic calm gone, replaced by raw hunger. He lifted a hand and gently, almost reverently, tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers were ice against my skin, and a shiver racked my entire body. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to my lips. My breath hitched. My mind, my fear, my principles, they all evaporated, leaving only a raw, desperate need. He was inches away, the moment stretching into an eternity. I could feel the cold radiating from him, see the battle raging in his eyes, and then something inside him snapped. He flinched back as if he'd been burned, his face a mask of self-loathing. He turned away, his hands braced against the steel workbench, his knuckles white. You should go, he said, his voice a raw, ragged whisper. He wouldn't look at me. Now. The warmth of the moment shattered, leaving behind a cold more profound than any he could possess. I grabbed my coat, my hands shaking, and fled. I didn't run out into the night. I ran from the lab, down the dark, echoing corridor, past the watching eyes of the portraits. My flight ended in the grand entrance hall, where I stood trembling by the heavy oak door, my mind racing, suddenly realizing the full, stupid reality of my situation. I was trapped. I heard his footsteps behind me, slow and measured. He didn't come close. He stopped a few feet away. I will take you home, he said. His voice was flat, formal again. The detached professor was back, a shield against the man who had almost lost control. The 30-minute drive back to Oakhaven was the longest hour of my life. The only sounds were the rhythmic swish of the windscreen wipers and the drumming of the rain on the roof. I stared out the passenger window, watching the dark, wet countryside streak by, the reflection of my own heartbroken face a ghostly image in the glass. I could feel him beside me, a block of ice and coiled tension. His hands were locked on the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. The air was thick with everything we couldn't say, every feeling we couldn't act on. It was an excruciating, shared torture. He pulled up in front of my dormitory. The engine idled, the sound deafening in the silence. For a moment, neither of us moved. I finally found my voice, a small, broken thing. "Thank you for the ride." "Emma," he began, his voice raw, but he cut himself off. I didn't wait for him to finish. I got out of the car and shut the door without looking back, leaving him alone in his sterile, luxurious cage. I ran through the rain, not from him this time, but from the unbearable ache in my own chest. The click of the lock behind me as I entered my dorm room was the only sound. I stood there for a moment, dripping onto the worn carpet. The rain on my coat a cold second skin. The agonizing silence of the car ride still echoing in my ears. "Right then," a voice said, breaking the quiet. I looked up. Sarah was sitting on her bed, a book lying open but unread in her lap. She had been waiting. She nodded toward the window which overlooked the dormitory entrance. "So," she began, her tone light and teasing, a playful grin on her face. "When were you going to tell me you were being chauffeured around by the campus mystery man himself?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "It's not what you think." "Isn't it?" She stood up, crossing her arms, the grin softening into genuine curiosity. "Come on, Em. How long has this been going on? Spill the beans?" I just shook my head, unable to form words, and sank into the chair at my desk, my whole body trembling with a cold that had nothing to do with the rain. Sarah's playful tone evaporated, replaced by the deep, unwavering concern of a best friend. She came and knelt beside my chair. "Hey," she said softly, "you look like you've seen a ghost." "He can't be that bad, can he? Did he do something?" "No," I whispered, the word catching in my throat. "He did nothing." "Do you like him?" She pressed gently. "What's he like?" "Really?" I thought of the frozen lake, of the raw pain in his eyes. "He's complicated." I finally gave her a piece of the truth, a safe, edited piece. "He invited me to his home, to work on my dissertation. He has a laboratory there." Sarah's eyes went wide. "A laboratory? At his estate?" She let out a low whistle. "Blimey, Emma. An estate, I knew it. So you two are seeing each other?" "No," I said, the word a lie and the truth all at once. "Not really." "It's... Sarah, please. Can we not talk about it?" A chasm opened between us. She saw me pulling away, locking a door she never knew existed. She looked hurt, but she nodded. "Okay, Em," she said, standing up and giving my shoulder a gentle squeeze. "I won't push. Until the day you ask me to be the godmother of your firstborn, my lips are sealed." She gave me a small, sad smile and went back to her side of the room, leaving me alone with my impossible secret. That conversation was the final push. Sarah's normal, logical questions highlighted the absolute insanity of my situation. I was living in a ghost story, and I was going mad from the not knowing. The ache in my chest demanded answers. If I couldn't speak the truth, then I had to find it. The next day, I skipped my lectures and went straight to the Oakhaven Town archives. I told the stern-faced woman at the desk I was researching the history of the area's prominent families. I started with the Vales. I learned that the family had been the primary benefactors of St. Giles University since its founding. And then I found the photographs. I spent hours scrolling through microfiche, my eyes burning from the strain, about to give up when I saw it. It was a photograph from the university's founding ceremony. The date printed at the bottom was October 12th, 1884. My breath caught. There, standing amongst a group of stern, bearded men, was a younger man, clean-shaven, his dark hair perfectly styled, his expression severe and profoundly sad. My hand trembled as I zoomed in. The image sharpened, and my heart stopped. My God. It must be his father, or grandfather. The thought was a desperate, logical anchor in a sea of confusion. The family resemblance is just uncanny. But the longer I stared, the more the anchor slipped. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was a perfect copy. The precise curve of his lip, the slight arch of his brow, and the eyes. The exact same ancient storm, the same guarded sorrow. It was a perfect duplicate, not a genetic echo. I felt a wave of dizziness and pushed back from the machine. I was tired. My eyes were playing tricks on me. That had to be it. I printed a copy of the photograph, my hands shaking, and left the archives clinging to the only explanation that made sense. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay in the darkness of my room, the silence pressing in. The image from the photograph was burned into my mind. I tried to dismiss it, to file it away as a family look-alike. But my scientific mind, the part of me that gathered data, demanded a single theory that could account for all the variables. I started listing them in my head, one by one. 1. The photograph. An identical man from 1884. Hypothesis. A striking family resemblance. 2. The lab. Impossible speed. A deep, lifeless cold. A strange vibrational hum. Hypothesis. A trick of the light. Adrenaline. But that didn't explain the cold or the hum. 3. The lake. His impossible appearance miles from anywhere. His refusal to explain how he found me. Hypothesis. A coincidence. But his words, "You are indeed here," were not the words of a man surprised by a coincidence. 4. The library. His visceral, personal pain when talking about an eternity. 5. The estate. The complete and total lack of mirrors. The pieces began to slam together, a terrifying, logical cascade. The family look-alike theory only explained the photograph. It explained nothing else. But there was another theory. An insane, impossible theory that accounted for everything. The speed, the cold, the hum, the impossible knowledge, the ancient pain, the mirrors, the face in the photograph. It was the only hypothesis that fit all the data. The blood drained from my face. The quiet of my dorm room became a suffocating tomb. The monster from my books, the impossible creature who loves for an eternity, wasn't a fantasy. He was real, and I was in love with him. The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. "Just need to pop over to the archives in Whitley," I said, trying to keep my voice casual as I faced Sarah. "They have a collection of parish records that St. Giles doesn't." Sarah, bless her, didn't even look up from her textbook. "Need the car, then?" "Keys are on the hook." The little metal keys felt impossibly heavy in my hand, a cold weight of purpose. This was it. There was no turning back. The drive out of Oakhaven was a blur of gray skies and bare, skeletal trees. Sarah's little Austin metro felt flimsy against the vast, empty landscape of the moors. The further I drove, the more the sky bruised, a dark purple-gray that promised a storm. Soon, the first drops of rain began to speckle the windscreen, and by the time I turned onto the long private road leading to Crowthergate Estate, the drizzle had become a downpour. I parked the car on the gravel expanse before the house, the engine sputtering into a silence that was immediately consumed by the drumming of the rain. For a moment, I just sat there, my hands locked on the steering wheel, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The house loomed before me, a dark stone beast half-shrouded in mist and rain. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I got out of the car. The cold rain plastered my hair to my face as I walked the final 50 yards to the massive oak door. I lifted my trembling hand, my fingers numb, aiming for the antique iron buzzer. I was an inch away. My knuckles hadn't even brushed the cold metal. Click. The sound of the heavy lock turning on its own was shockingly loud. The door swung inward on silent hinges, opening into the dim, cavernous hall. And he was just standing there, waiting for me. A silhouette against the gloom. My breath hitched. He knew. He had been expecting me. All the desperate, logical explanations I had clung to evaporated in that single, impossible moment. He didn't speak. He just inclined his head, a silent command. I stepped inside, the great door swinging shut behind me with a final, echoing thud. He turned and started walking, and I followed, a ghost in his wake. Down the long, echoing corridors, past the watching eyes of the portraits. But he didn't lead me to the lab, our sanctuary of science. He led me up a grand, sweeping staircase, into a wing of the house I had never seen. He stopped before a heavy wooden door and pushed it open, gesturing for me to enter. His room. It was not the room of a 28-year-old man. It was timeless. A huge, 4-poster bed dominated one wall. Bookshelves stretched to the ceiling, filled with ancient, leather-bound volumes. A telescope was pointed at the tall, mullioned window, and antique maps were framed on the walls. It was the room of a scholar, a prisoner, a man who had lived for a very, very long time. He walked past me to the window and stood with his back to me, looking out at the rain as it melted the last stubborn patches of winter snow on the lawn. "So," he began, his voice a low, weary murmur, "you found out." The words were so direct, so devoid of surprise, they threw me off balance. Found out what? What are you talking about? The question screamed in my head, a last, desperate grasp for denial. The photograph was still in my coat pocket, my one piece of proof, and he had already rendered it obsolete. "Don't play games with me, Emma," he said, his voice quiet but laced with steel. He turned around to face me. His eyes were colder than I had ever seen them, twin shards of winter ice. The sorrow was gone, replaced by a raw, ancient weariness that was almost terrifying to behold. "Why are you here?" The question hung in the air, stripping away all my pretenses. I wasn't a student. I wasn't a researcher. I was a girl who had stumbled upon an impossible truth and had been reckless enough to follow it to its source. He was asking me to name my purpose. Was I here to accuse him? To run from him? I looked into his eyes, and the answer came out. A small, broken whisper of the truth that had been hiding beneath all my fear. Because I had to know. A flicker of something, pain, regret, passed over his face. He gave a slow, tired nod, as if accepting a verdict that had been handed down centuries ago. "Yes," he said, his voice hollow. "I suppose you did." He gestured to an armchair by the unlit fireplace. "Then you should know it all." The room was silent, save for the drumming of the rain against the tall window. I sank into the worn leather armchair he had gestured to, my hands clasped in my lap to keep them from shaking. He didn't sit. He remained standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the storm-gray light, the ghost in his own story. "I was born in 1860, he began, his voice a low, hollow sound that seemed to come from a great distance. "This house. It was my world. I wasn't a second son. destined for the military or the church. I was the heir. My life was a map, drawn out for me before I took my first breath. But my passion was never for land or titles. It was for the world of my father's library. For science. He spoke of his youth with a detached, academic sorrow, as if describing a specimen under glass. He spoke of his excitement for discovery, for a world that was shedding the skin of superstition and embracing the light of reason and electricity. He was a man of the future, trapped in the body of a relic. "And then there was Eleonora," he said, his voice softening, cracking just a little on her name. She was the daughter of a visiting professor. Her mind was incandescent, brighter than my own. We would spend hours in the laboratory, arguing about Faraday and Maxwell. She saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. He turned from the window then, and I saw his face. The weariness was gone, replaced by the ghost of a memory so beautiful it was agonizing to behold. "I loved her," he whispered, with a purity I didn't know I was capable of. A love that felt ordered, permanent, a defiance against a chaotic universe. He was using my own words, and it was like a knife to the heart. "She died in the winter of 1883. Influenza. I, the man of science, could do nothing but watch as a thing I couldn't see, an enemy I couldn't fight, stole the brightest light from my world. She was 21. The pain in the room was a tangible thing, a cold, heavy pressure. My grief, it made me a fool. I sought out darkness, legends, whispers of a cure for death. I found something else." His voice turned to ice. It was not a gift. It was a violation. A biological curse that stopped my heart, froze me in time, and left me trapped at the very peak of my sorrow. A perfect, unchanging monument to the moment my world ended. I stared at him, my own grief for the young man he had been, for the love he had lost, choking me. "So what does it mean?" I finally asked, my voice a broken whisper. "The cold? The speed?" He walked over to the unlit fireplace, bracing his hands on the marble mantelpiece. "They are merely symptoms of the disease. My body no longer generates its own heat. It only consumes it. My physical abilities are an evolutionary advantage for a predator. The lack of reflection, an anomaly of light I have never fully understood." He finally looked at me, his eyes full of a terrifying, final truth. "But those are not the real danger, Emma. The danger is in the chemistry, the desire. For you, a rising heart rate is a sign of passion. For me, it is the trigger for a hunt. When my control is tested, an energy builds inside me, a predatory state that is volatile." He pushed himself away from the mantelpiece, taking a slow step toward me. "It is not a curse of the soul," he said, his voice low and chillingly precise. "It is a biological reaction. My blood against yours. It would be like combustion. A fire that would consume you from the inside out. I can touch you. But I can never, ever lose control with you." The title of my own story, the one I had been unknowingly writing in my heart, echoed in my mind. The man who could not touch me the way I want. "My father understood this," he continued, his voice hollow. "He still does. He calls me a monument to a dead woman. He believes any love I feel will only make a ghost of the one I care for. And he is not wrong. He stood before me now, the full, monstrous, heartbreaking truth of him laid bare. He was a cage built around a memory, and his love was the key to a door I could never walk through." "So now you know," he whispered, his face a mask of pure, selfless agony. "You know it all. I am a monster trapped in a memory, and the kindest thing you can do for both of us is to save yourself." His eyes pleaded with me, a final, desperate act of love. "Please, leave," his final word, leave, hung in the air between us, a verdict and a plea all in one. It was the kindest, most cruel thing he had ever said to me. I don't remember walking out of his room or down the grand, sweeping staircase. I don't remember passing the silent, watching portraits. My first clear thought came when I was back behind the wheel of Sarah's Austin Metro, the keys cold in my hand, the engine turning over with a sputtering cough. The drive back to Oakhaven was a journey through a ghost world. The drumming of the rain on the roof, the rhythmic swish of the windscreen wipers, the glow of the dashboard. It was all a flimsy imitation of reality. My own world, the one I had known just hours before, had been burned to the ground. I was driving through the ashes. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, but I was a passenger in my own body. My mind was a silent, screaming void. I was born in 1860. My blood against yours? It would be like combustion. The thoughts were not my own. They were foreign objects, sharp pieces of glass that had been forced into my brain. I stumbled back into my dorm room like a sleepwalker. Sarah was there, and she looked up, her face a mixture of relief and concern. You're soaked. Was it worth the trip? Did you find what you were looking for? I stared at her. My best friend. A girl worried about essays and boys from the pub. A girl who lived in the light. And I, in the space of an afternoon, had become a creature of shadow. The chasm between us was no longer a crack. It was a canyon. I'm just tired, I mumbled, the lie feeling heavy and useless on my tongue. I walked past her, stripped off my wet clothes, and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. She watched me for a long time, her kindness a spotlight I couldn't bear. Okay, Em, she finally said, her voice soft with a hurt I couldn't fix. Get some rest. But there was no rest. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the rain, and the two sides of my soul went to war. The scientist, the rational part of me that had been my anchor my entire life, was screaming. It was the voice of self-preservation, cold and logical. He is a predator. His biology is designed to consume. He told you himself. His father is right. Loving him is a death sentence. You saw the portraits in his home, a gallery of ghosts. Do you want to become one of them? Run. Run and never look back. Save yourself. But then, the other voice would answer. The quiet, stubborn voice of the girl who read old books and believed in tragic love. It didn't speak of logic. It spoke of feeling. It showed me not the monster, but the man, the prisoner. It showed me his eyes in the library, raw with a pain so profound it had burned away his soul. It showed me his agonizing self-control. His hands clenched, choosing to hurt himself rather than risk hurting me. It showed me the weary, heartbroken man in the rain, confessing a truth that would surely drive me away. His warning to me, his plea for me to run. It wasn't a threat. It was the most selfless, loving act I had ever witnessed. He was trying to save me from himself. I was trapped between two unbearable truths. The truth of what he was, and the truth of who he is. And then, I thought of her. His grandmother. I saw her again in my mind, standing in that gloomy hall. I remembered the look she had given him. Not one of fear or pity, but of a deep, unwavering and profound love. She was human, and she had loved him her entire life. She had lived alongside the monster and had not been destroyed. She was not a ghost. She was the one piece of data that didn't fit his father's grim equation. She was the proof that another path existed. A path of love, not just survival. The war inside me ended. The screaming of my rational mind quieted, and the whisper of my heart became a clear, steady truth. He had given me a choice between the cold, empty safety of the world I knew and the terrifying, beautiful warmth of a love that could burn me to ashes. He had told me to save myself. And I would. I sat up in bed, the darkness of the room no longer feeling like a tomb, but like a beginning. My salvation wasn't in running away from the monster. It was in running back and choosing to love the man.
Sorrow spin. Every chord another bruise. Every line a sin. Flicker over our ghosts, dancing in dust and regret. You said love was just pretend, but I can't unlearn